Hello and welcome to another topic worthy of discussion, my series for newer players on drafting. Today we're talking about one of the more complex topics in Magic, tempo. What is it? What do I need to know about it? And most importantly, how can I win games with it? I'm breaking this up into 3 parts. The next 2 parts will be in my next 2 posted drafts, or you can find them in my topics worthy of discussion playlist on YouTube. Tempo is an important concept, and unfortunately, everyone describes it differently. What I'm going to try and do here is create a working definition that we can actually apply to games as we go. I'll most closely follow the ideas of someone that calls himself Professor Newton. The ideas I'll present here are ones that made sense to me, and ones that I'm hoping newer players will find useful in both how they build and execute their decks. What is tempo? We'll start with our basic definition and then expand that definition as we go. To start, tempo is the beats you have played affecting creatures on the board relative to beats played by your opponent. So whenever you play cards that affect creatures on the board, you get beats. Your opponent gets beats as well for playing their own cards. Then the tempo advantage at any given point goes to whoever has played the most beats. We can get a little more specific about how exactly you can earn beats and add to your tempo. Playing a creature gives a beat. Playing a creature impacts creatures on the board, so it will create a beat and add to your tempo. Killing a creature gives a beat. If you take a creature off the board, that's a beat that adds to your tempo. Buffing a creature may give a beat depending on how it's used. You'll get a beat providing the buff made a permanent difference to the board. I'll show you what I mean in a second. Creatures trading don't give beats. By our definition, tempo is about what more you have done to affect the game than your opponent. In most cases, forcing creatures to trade in combat isn't doing more than your opponent, so we don't give any beats to either player when that happens. And finally, some cards give multiple beats. For example, if you cast a removal spell that wipes all 4 of your opponent's creatures, you get 4 beats, 1 for each creature you killed. For example, take the Sand Strangler. The Strangler is a creature, so playing it would count as a beat. Also, if you control a desert when you play the Strangler, it will deal 3 damage to an opposing creature. If this kills the creature, you get an extra beat, 1 for playing a creature and 1 for killing a creature. If you attack with your Strangler, and you pump it with Giant Growth, the beats you're awarded varies depending on how the Giant Growth is used. Suppose, for example, your opponent doesn't block, and you cast Giant Growth anyways. You would not get a beat. You played a card that doesn't affect the board because by the end of the turn the Strangler will lose the +3/+3. You don't get a beat, but of course if you finished your opponent, it's still a great play. If, however, you attack with the Strangler and your opponent blocks, the situation changes. Suppose your Giant Growth saves your Strangler and kills their creature. In that case, Giant Growth gives you a single beat for killing 1 creature with it. But if your Strangler still dies anyways, you don't get any beats. All you accomplished was forcing 2 creatures to trade, and as we said earlier, creatures trading doesn't affect tempo. Counting tempo. What's great about our definition is you can count how much tempo each player has in the game. Simply add up the beats for each player, and the tempo advantage goes to whoever has played more beats. So if player 1 has played 5 beats, and player 2 has played 3 beats, player 1 has a tempo advantage of 2. As the game goes longer, this count becomes less relevant, but it's still a useful tool for analyzing tempo. Let's play a quick simple game to illustrate how beats work. In this game, each player will start with only 5 cards, won't draw anything, and will just play the first 3 turns. Each player is holding some land in hand, as well as 2 types of spells. The first spell is Shock, a 1-mana spell that can deal 2 damage to any target. The second spell is Walking Corpse, a 2-mana spell that gives you a plain old 2/2 creature. Here we have our board. You can see player A along the bottom and player B along the top. On the right side, in the corners, we'll count the beats for each player. Alright, let's go. On turn 1, acting first, player A drops a land. By our definition, land does not count as a beat because it doesn't affect creatures on the board and therefore adds no tempo. This is where we diverge from some other definitions. By our definition, what matters is creatures in play, so no tempo for the land. Again, I want to emphasize I'm not claiming that other definitions of tempo are wrong. I've just found this is what works for me. Player B also plays a land and passes the turn. Now player A drops another land and casts a creature. The creature gives him +1 beat for affecting creatures on the board, and he takes the tempo lead. Before the end of player A's turn, player B shocks the walking corpse. This kills the creature, so player B gets a beat for affecting creatures on the board. Both players now have the same tempo. This is a good example of how playing cheap spells can help your tempo. The player acting second often falls behind in tempo early, because the player acting first is half a turn ahead of them. Here player B has used a cheap spell, Shock, to equalize the tempo before his second turn, so he can swing tempo in his favor when he casts his next spell. On his turn, player B plays his own walking corpse and takes the tempo lead. On turn 3, player A has nothing else to do, so he shocks the walking corpse. He gains a beat, and the players are tied in tempo at this point. This is where we diverge from more definitions of tempo. Some argue that spending less mana to answer a threat than it costs gives you a tempo advantage. In this case, the walking corpse costs 2 to cast, but the shock only costs 1 to cast. We give player A a beat for affecting creatures on the board with his shock, but does he gain extra tempo from the fact he spent less mana to answer the threat? By our definition, he does not. I totally agree that spending less mana to answer a threat than it costs can be useful and gives you an advantage. The shock we saw earlier on turn 2 is a good example. However, simply spending less mana to answer a threat doesn't add tempo here. It doesn't add tempo because player A has nothing else to do with his extra mana. If player A had cards in hand and could follow this up with another walking corpse, then he would gain tempo by playing 2 beats on the same turn. By our definition, that makes sense. But spending less mana than your opponent is only helpful if you can do something with that extra mana, so in itself, it makes no difference. Why is tempo important? Why do we care about tempo, you might ask? Firstly, and most importantly, tempo wins games. It's a basic way many games are won. If you come out strong and your opponent doesn't, you will kill your opponent quickly. In other words, if you build some quick tempo, you can turn that tempo into some quick wins. Some other points we could make about tempo. Some decks are designed to tempo. In other words, they look to play as many beats as they can, as quickly as they can, and end the game early. Providing you pick up cards that can support this strategy, this is something you can have success with, and it is not a strategy restricted to any particular color pair. However, you don't have to specifically design your deck in a certain way to take advantage of tempo. Especially in draft, the direction each game takes may depend more on what each player happens to draw than the specific objective of each deck. This means you can easily end up on early offense with your control deck, or on early defense with your aggro deck. Understanding how to push tempo when it's on your side, and slow tempo when it's against you, is a huge part of having long-term success in draft. Also, a low mana curve favors tempo. The cheaper your spells are, the more likely you can use multiple spells or effects on the same turn. Doing more than your opponent early gives you beats, and if you have more beats than your opponent, you'll take the tempo lead. This also ties into what I said with the previous point. Having a low curve gives you the flexibility of creating tempo early if given the opportunity, even if that's not the main objective of your deck. Having the initiative can pay off. Going first can be an advantage for tempo decks. Acting first, your opponent is half a turn behind. you play beats before your opponent and can keep your mana open while you attack and your opponent is tapped out. Cash in for damage whenever you can. As the game goes longer, tempo becomes less relevant, and your cheaper spells may get outclassed by your opponent. We'll come back to this problem in Tempo Part 2. Cheat removal with cheap creatures is often ideal. If you're looking to kill your opponent quickly, the biggest problem you'll have is blockers. By using removal, you remove blockers, and this makes it easier to cash in your tempo for damage. You still need creatures, of course, that can get in, but trading off is less effective and both prevents you from dealing damage and makes it harder to deal damage later. If you use combat tricks, your opponent can still block first, which prevents damage as well. But combat tricks are cheap, and your opponent is likely to tap out early, which can make them effective in tempo decks. And finally, tempo gives card advantage in several different ways. For example, your opponent may be forced to double block when you attack, and a single combat trick can kill multiple creatures. Or perhaps you can force them to use spells inefficiently just to survive. Maybe your opponent is forced to play cards in an order they would rather not play them, or cast spells without optional costs they would have preferred. An unkicked Roost of Drakes would be a great example. And finally, your opponent may be forced to chump block just to survive, which is more card advantage. The concept of card advantage is closely related to tempo, but that's all we'll say about it here. We're talking tempo after all. That's it for part 1 on tempo. Stay tuned for my next video as we'll build on our definition and address some of the more interesting aspects of tempo.